So, over the last month, I was trying to decide what game I wanted to tackle next on the channel, which led me to trying some of the ones on my list and see what tickles my fancy the most. I decided it'd be fun to just sort of throw everything into this one video. You kind of need an angle for that though, otherwise it's just a guy sitting in his room and talking about games. That's not very interesting. So, gimmicky PS2 action games. That's the video. Let's go do it. Nanobreaker is an action game developed by Konami with much of the same team that worked on Castlevania Curse of Darkness, and it uses a modified version of Lament of Innocence's game engine. All of that, and it was produced by Koji Igarashi, who was responsible for a lot of Castlevania stuff, and more recently for helming the Bloodstained series. But really, his most important role was as a scenario writer for the greatest game ever made, Tokimeki Memorial. And as such, Nanobreaker has a lot of the same sort of textural feelings that Lament of Innocence had, except now we've got a game that feels a lot simpler in its level design structure and much gorier too. See, Nanobreaker is one of those delicious action games that tries its hardest to be bloody and gory and verbose in the way it constantly lets you know just how much damage you're doing to your enemies. Hence the blood meter in the bottom right of the screen. Jake Warren has been sent into a bad situation where only he can get into Nanomachine Island, rescue an important scientist, and somehow put a stop to the Alchemic threat that's potentially going to end the world if no one can stop it. Essentially, it's Escape from New York combined with The Thing and maybe a little splash of the first live-action Resident Evil movie. Nanobreaker is a very grey, drab kind of game, which is an interesting aspect to really focus on. A colorless world where violence is the only thing that gives it any sort of life, any sort of vibrancy, especially if you toggle the mixed colored setting and get ready to have a party, which is already weird, by the way. Why is the blood color setting called liquid color? To me, it's actually a term that coincides with some of the game's themes about violence and conflict. That at a certain point, our enemies in the game are simply meaningless fodder that don't have any semblance of humanity left within them. They don't bleed when you hit them, they simply pour out liquid. One that we get to have fun with and decide what kind of light show we want when it all sprays out of them. It's deeply dehumanizing, but it's more than that too. It's kind of horrific to think about. The truth behind the liquid is that it's quite literally oil, like the kind of oil that a machine would need to function in some way. Any semblance of who or what the human being was before the Alchemic has been completely wiped away down to the blood that coursed through their veins. To coincide with that idea, we got a world that seemingly had all of its personality ripped out in place for a series of environments that are only there to act as an area for you to hack away in. It's all so bleak, indistinguishable, and devoid of real life, which could be seen as a criticism of the game's art direction, but I think this is actually pretty intentional alongside the very thing we just talked about. The aesthetic of Nanobreaker is deeply mechanical and monochromatic, with the human element showing through in brutalistic violence. And if that's not a commentary on humanity's need for conflict, I don't know what is. Nanobreaker doubles down on that sentiment too, and balances it with a combat system that, weirdly enough, acts as a beautiful counterpoint to the hell of the scenario, where your sword creates these beautiful streams of light, starting off as a pale blue cutting through your enemies, but slowly turning red as you cut and cut and cut and cut. There's almost a mesmerizing quality to the action in that sense, where your attacks flow smoothly from one combo to the next, allowing you to keep up the barrage of attacks without taking a breath. And when the battle is all said and done, all you have to show for it is a battlefield covered in blood, or in my case, legally distinct blood-like substances. This beautiful twist to the combat comes out in full force when you slice through enough enemies and enter a boosted state. In this state, your attacks are faster, and you see almost skeletal wings come out from Jake's back. To me, obviously building aesthetic connections to something like an Angel of Death. It's very subtle. In deeper gameplay terms, Nanobreaker is working with some pretty neat stuff. Jake has horizontal and vertical attack buttons, square and triangle respectively, that can be combined to perform different styles of combos. These varieties are great for crowd control 1 second and more focused damage the next. And like I mentioned before, the downtime between each combo is incredibly small, which lets you pump them out pretty quickly. Offense is the name of the game here, and the intention is that you rip and tear through these enemies without hesitation. This system truly thrives in scenarios where enemies litter the screen because of how satisfying weaving your combos together is. And obviously it conjured up a lot of the feelings I had when I played the PS2 Castlevanias. Though I think Nanobreaker is a much smoother playing game in comparison when it comes to the combat. What's even more impressive though is the combo chip system, where you can collect combo chips and then open up your menu and say hello to a sprawling diagram of combo opportunities. Placing a combo chip on these nodes opens up brand new combo chains, and none of these choices are permanent, by the way. You can take off any combo chip at any point in the game to experiment with your moveset and see which actions you prefer to use over others. And while this is mostly for aesthetic purposes, since your basic combos are arguably more than enough to take through the entire game, it's still a very cool system. Outside of horizontal and vertical attacks, you also have shift attacks, where if you hold R1 and then press square or triangle, you'll do slower but more powerful attacks. These come in the form of a stab or a upward slash, and this can be comboed into aerial attacks which do a ton of damage. Following up the upward slash with either this slamming down attack or this downward stab feels very good to do and gives you some very good variety, especially when one enemy in particular has pissed you off to the extent that it needs this special treatment. Jake's plasma sword transforms into a giant axe or scythe with some combos too, which is a neat visual touch. Though I can't help but wonder if it would have been a little cooler if these were bespoke weapon modes with their own entire combos. But then we'd have something that resembles DMC the DMC, and yeah, I don't think I want to approach that just yet. Anyway, the gimmick for this one is the gallons gauge on the bottom right here. As you cut and slice and dice and chop and make beautiful artistry with your plasma sword, the amount of oil you spill is measured in gallons. This gauge's real purpose is to tie into the idea that this overwhelming violence has been desensitized mechanically and condensed into something that feels somewhat close to a point scoring system in any other action game.
I would compare it to S ranks in Devil May Cry, but this time the S stands for slippery. Ooh.
Except here the goal isn't necessarily just to swing your sword in cool ways, but to also celebrate in how much allegorical blood you've just spilled. We get a lot of games that cover concepts that violence is in our nature, but one that we should strive to rise above, and Nanobreaker doesn't really do any of that at all. It sort of wears its violent ideas as an aesthetic to add an edgy edge to the whole thing, and that's fine, I'm okay with that. Not everything has to be the thing that makes you reflect on your whole life up until now. There's also the hallmarks of stuff I think don't really work in an action game, like janky platforming and kind of annoying checkpointing, but that's just a thing we deal with in this genre, it feels like. I'm not going to waste much time complaining about that. I'm sure there are plenty of videos out there that do that already. Nanobreaker's a cool time though, if you really vibed with the PS2 Castlevanias and want something more from the same guys. And, before I forget, hey, this game's kinda like Rising Revengeance! Have you ever watched a show with or about mechs and thought, why are these people inside the mechs? That's not very smart. They could get shot or stabbed or face some emotional trauma that might not be the best time to come face to face with right now. Unless you're an Armored Core pilot. In that case, yeah, you've got nothing in that soul except a yearning to try out a new laser cannon or strap a couple of rockets to the back of your AC for funsies. Robot Alchemic Drive asks instead, why don't we control the mechs like remote-controlled cars? Giant alien robots called Volgara are invading the Earth, and the player character, one of 3 possible choices you make, is the only one with a wealthy enough family to have developed a mech capable of fighting back, the Mega Knight. What follows is a series of missions and situations that put your remote-controlled piloting skills to the test. Battles play out entirely from the perspective of your character, and switching over to control the mech simply focuses the camera on the mech from wherever the player character is standing. So you have to find a good vantage point to view the battle, but be careful to not stay too close, or else you'll be standing on a building that will definitely collapse as you send the Volgara flying through it. The Mega Knight has 2 control schemes, one called Easy, and the other that's the intended way to control the thing. Easy lets you move the Mega Knight with the control stick as you might expect from a standard control scheme, but the one that has the most charm is the scheme that has you moving the Mega Knight with the 4 shoulder buttons. R1 and L1 operate the forward motion of its right and left legs respectively, while R2 and L2 do the same thing but in reverse. Holding both R1 and R2 turns the Mega Knight to the right, and the opposite is done with L1 and L2. Fighting the Volgara, if you can manage to make your way over to one, is done with the analog sticks, with both sticks controlling one arm each. And if you've played Fight Night Round 2 for the GameCube, or whatever else that game is on, I guess, I don't know. You know what to expect here. You flick the stick for different kinds of punches that can either do a little damage or send the Volgara flying backwards, which, believe it or not, is not something you always want to do since some buildings are in need of protection. You also gain access to some ranged weapons like rockets and what I think is some kind of plasma boomerang of some kind, and these may very well be the funniest inclusion the game has. It is so incredibly difficult to fire these things with any sort of reliable accuracy, and when you miss, the camera will let you know by tracking the path of the rockets right to their destination, just so that there's no mistaking that you were the one to take down the hospital that was just built last year. This is an inherently quirky control scheme, and one that will definitely take a lot of getting used to, but it's also the one that makes Robot Alchemic Drive feel so unique in the first place. That feeling of fumbling around on a controller, struggling to reach the Volgara before it destroys something that matters to you in your hometown, is a pretty engaging one. The game also contrasts the extremely personal feelings these battles have with news reports before, during, and after the mission that reminds you that there's a whole country and world watching these fights take place, which tethers a lot of the crazier aspects of the experience together in a way that still feels very funny, albeit a lot more grounded too. There's an element of satisfaction to the destruction here, as is the case with most mech stuff in general. We kinda want things to get blown up, destroyed, and generally obliterated with no real prejudice in mind. I remember playing Zone of the Enders and punching robots into buildings and having a great time until the game told me that I shouldn't be doing that. And they're right, we shouldn't. And yes, this is the game that you've probably seen this scene from.
No! The bakery! That's where I work!
Now, this is funny, but Robot Alchemic Drive doesn't really want it to be. A lot of this game is spent on the ground floor with you running or sometimes hovering over to where the Volgara is rampaging, forcing you to watch for a minute or two as its trail of destruction seemingly has no end. These quiet neighborhoods erupt in flames and chaos, with the sadness being too much for the frame rate to handle at times. And after soaking it in for a moment, your Mega Knight is finally ready to do battle, but only after inevitable loss and destruction. These visuals of small Japanese cities feel so strangely lifelike to me. Sure, that lacking in any serious detail, but the approximation here is more than enough to carry the vibe the game wants to get across. You see everything you need to see, from the train stations to the skyscrapers and the small houses that litter the map, all set around color palettes that feel pretty drab but do let in the smallest amounts of color and life every so often. That's kind of where Robot Alchemic Drive is the most interesting to me. The quiet moments where we see the world as it should be, peaceful, quaint, with people living their lives and enjoying the time together, only to be completely eradicated in the next comically devastating moment. People will laugh at Nanao's bakery being flattened, but this is the moment in the game that truly cements what you're fighting for. You're fighting for the simplicity of this life. The scale of these fights is astounding at times too, with the Mega Knight and Volgara towering over smaller houses and being about eye level with 11-story apartment buildings, stretching out of the water and ominously making their way inland with the intent to demolish everything in their way. Once you get past how cool all of this is, you're left with a sense of dread. A realization that everything in our lives really is this fragile and easy for such a cold, heartless being to tear down if they so desired. This is the tricky thing with mecha stories in general. Sometimes it's hard to separate the cool factor from the innate terror of the reality of this sort of stuff. But that's also what makes it so engaging at the same time, right? That balance between the horrors of war, the reality of violence, and that no matter how far our technological advances go, we as a collective species can still pale in comparison to nature itself, or the comic whims of the cosmic skies. But then, understanding that and looking inward to the humanity humanity of the characters in play, their desire for a simpler life after the supposed necessity of their situation, culminating in a brighter tomorrow, free of the pain of today. That's what's worth fighting for. Anyway, let's shoot some guns. 10,000 Bullets was developed by Blue Moon Studio, a company created by Yoshitaka Murayama of Suikoden fame. And if you've played Suikoden before, I can tell you that this is the furthest thing from Suikoden anyone could ever make. Which isn't a bad thing. It's actually a pretty good game right here. 10,000 Bullets is what you'd get if you took Max Payne and that Kung Fu mod it has and make it an actual product that could be sold on store shelves. I would argue that 10,000 Bullets has more in common with rail shooters like Time Crisis. There's a very similar vibe of insane ballistic action, except with more flips and slow motion shooting in 10,000 Bullets. And there are times when this game feels incredibly cool. Triple jumping in slow motion around a cavalcade of bullets as you take out everyone at... I'm speechless. It's that good. It's incredible. In terms of the gimmick, that's really it right there. Slow-mo action shooting that combines the ideals of a rail shooter with a third-person shoot-'em-up sort of thing. That's not really a gimmick per se, but I don't really care. There's obviously plenty of jank here too, though. You can see it pretty plainly in this footage. Movement feels kind of sticky and weird sometimes. Wrangling the camera and lock on to target a specific enemy can feel a little loose and imprecise, and there are times where you're jumping in slow motion where you'll get stuck in animation and be unable to shoot your guns, which leads to you taking some unnecessary damage. 10,000 Bullets is a hard game to manage at times with the amount of enemies it throws at you in pretty tight spaces, which makes the generous amount of slow motion you get pretty handy because you'll likely be using this most of the time you're in a fight. The pacing of these fights is also greatly helped by the lock-on mechanic where if you time a shot just right as the reticle turns red, you'll be able to get a critical hit, which stops you from just spamming the fire button and running into a Star Wars bounty hunter sort of problem. Repetitive shooting like that gets boring pretty quickly and can hurt if you're a older gamer. 10,000 Bullets tells the story of, look, I'll be honest, I didn't really pay much attention to that bit. Honestly, that's not really why I'm here, so I haven't got much to say in that regard. I don't really have much to talk about with this game in general, other than it being a very tight shooter that manages to combine the vibe of a 3D brawler with something more akin to a rail shooter, like I mentioned. Based on that alone, I recommend anyone that wants this exact concoction to go back and try this game out. It's very good. Evergrace is a game that feels a lot like the evolution of series like Kingsfield while evolving that structure in different ways too. Now, when the PS2 launched, FromSoft released 3 games: Armored Core 2, Evergrace, and Eternal Ring. Eternal Ring is the game that more faithfully follows the conventions of Kingsfield in the sense that it's a first-person dungeon crawler with very similar pacing and design intents. Evergrace takes this idea and changes up some pretty key conventions. Instead of it being in first person, the camera is shifted back to a third person view. Instead of there being a single simple attack, we've got a couple on each weapon that suit different situations. Attacks can ding off walls in this game, so if you've got a bigger weapon, you'd be careful that you don't hit the wall and leave yourself open to attack. This is when you might want to use a weapon's vertical or poking attack to not embarrass yourself. There's also a much more relaxed sort of vibe in this game compared to most dungeon crawlers, it feels like. Most outdoor areas have this sort of dream-like vibe with colors that pop in distinct and vaguely strange ways. The bright orange ground mixed with the greenish sky makes the world teeter on the edge of feeling naturalistic and a tiny bit magical. Then there's the music, which has this jumpy, chaotic approach that works with the underlying melodies in most of the songs. And this ends up making Evergrace feel like a quirky, little, weird PS2 game. The aesthetic here is 3 parts whimsical fantasy and 1 part LSD dream simulator, which fulfills the quota for what I'm looking for in all honesty. And that's kind of what you come to Evergrace for at the end of the day. If you're coming here to tick off another backlog game or have gone back after being a Dark Souls fan for 14 years, I'm not sure how much you'll really vibe with Evergrace off the bat. But if you're coming through the door specifically to try something that feels a little experimental, sort of janky, and kind of not great in a lot of ways, you might get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I think from the offset, there are a lot of comparisons that could be made to a game like Majora's Mask, which shares a lot of Evergrace's weirder, hard-to-place vibes. It feels kind of incorrect to call it dreamlike, honestly, but I think it being so hard to place is enough of a descriptor in itself. The structure isn't too dissimilar to a Zelda game either, I guess. You do have dungeons with puzzles, but no hookshot or anything like that. So really what's the point, I guess. There's no overworld either. It's a much more linearly designed world in that sense. So yeah, kinda like a Zelda game, I guess, but also nothing like it at all. Now, there are a couple of big gimmicks in Evergrace that help it stand out from other games of its kind, which aren't that many, but still. In fact, hang on, the game that's most similar to Evergrace is probably Baroque for the PS2. That's kind of weird. That's also kind of interesting. Anyway, as for the main gimmick, we've got something that's very cool. 2 protagonists that we can switch between at any time. This kind of thing works out very well because there's a central mystery at the heart of Evergrace, as you don't really know what connects these two, since they start at completely different places and meet different characters at the start of their journeys. And then as you play through their routes, you end up going to the same locations and retread some of the same ground. Now, this mechanic is cool, but has a pretty big flaw in what comes up in Charlene's route, which is that it is way shorter than Darius's. It's not half the length or anything that extreme, but it is distinctly shorter, and I believe that's seemingly a side effect of development decisions. From what I gather, Charlene's scenario was originally cut during development back when Evergrace was being developed for the PS1, but then when the game moved over to the PS2, FromSoft decided to add it back in, but I assume didn't have enough time to truly flesh out her half of the game. Though it's kind of impressive that her side of things doesn't feel even rougher. All in all, it's pretty cool that she was able to get her story told here alongside Darius's. I just wish it was an hour or 2 longer. Darius and Charlene themselves play pretty much the same, but have access to 2 different weapon types. Darius has swords and Charlene has bows. In practice, this obviously means one can deal with enemies from far away and one attacks them up close, but Darius has access to ranged magic anyway, and Charlene has melee weapons too. So this difference doesn't actually make you approach things too differently. Dual protagonist stuff in games is cool anyway though. I am admittedly a sucker for this sort of thing. I just wish that there was more that distinguished Darius's gameplay to Charlene's. Maybe one of the routes could have been more puzzle oriented, with the other following the usual actiony dungeony formula. That, or maybe the routes could have had more unique aesthetics, with each character going to very distinctly different places. As it is, both characters honestly feel the same, and feel like they're going on extremely similar journeys. Dual protagonists isn't the only gimmick though, as there is a PS2 staple here as well: pressure sensitivity. Evergrace uses it in a pretty smart way. On the bottom left of the screen is the power gauge. This is both your health bar and the meter that displays how much stamina you have left. Stamina goes down when you sprint, but also when you attack, and squeezing the attack button down harder will cause you to use up more of the gauge in exchange for doing more damage. Attacks are very short animations though. You don't really have much of a reason then to not just hold down the button all the way every time you attack. You end up doing more damage, and the amount of time it takes to get your next swing out makes it feel fine to wait a second or 2 more to get the optimal amount of damage out. There's really no reason that I can think of that you would want to half press the attack button. It would be a bit different if you couldn't sprint without any stamina, because then it would be a distinct choice, right? Attack, have a little bit of stamina there to break away from the enemy if needed, or go all in guns blazing. But that's not really how it works. Even if you expend all the energy on an attack, you can still run or even just walk out of the way and recuperate, and you'll be fine 90% of the time. So overall, this system feels
a little underbaked, but it's quirky and fun and nice to have something that uses the pressure-sensitive buttons in a fun way. Anyway, that's not the real gimmick I care about anyway. The one that really matters is customization. Now in 2000, this was a pretty cool thing to see, especially since most console RPGs at the time wouldn't necessarily show your equipped items on your character. And in Evergrace, you get to choose the colors of your armor and weigh up the stats of each versus how cool or funny they look. They even become integral to some puzzle solutions at different points in the game. Character customization when done like this is very much my kind of shit, and there's some very fun ideas here that make full use of the system to make you think about the kind of stuff you wear in different ways. And I think we take for granted how tricky it is to make systems like these feed into the overall flow of the game. Because fashion stuff is always fun, but I can't think of a game that made me interact with this sort of thing in this sort of way since Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It's very cool. As far as the story is concerned, I'll be honest, I didn't understand a single thing that was happening. And that's fine. There's plenty of other videos out there that dig into Evergrace's story in ways that I could not even fathom. So go check those out if you're interested in seeing what's going on, because I know for a fact that I don't. Now I could sit here and continue to talk about all the stuff that Evergrace doesn't do particularly well, but let's face it, that doesn't really matter all that much to me. If you like any of what I just talked about, even the littlest bit, I would recommend at least trying the game out yourself and seeing what it's about. The more experimental edge of the PS2 generation is one that had a lot of criticism in the day, and even now I don't think that these sorts of games get the respect that they deserve. Unique ideas that make you rethink the way a game has to be designed or structured are what deserve more praise, regardless of their execution. So yeah, that's 4 games. It took a little while to get this one out, and sorry about that, and I don't really know what's going to be next just yet, but I've got some more stuff cooking away, so be patient and see you soon, maybe. Hopefully. Okay, goodbye.